Well, hello, church history friends. My name is Barb Walden, and I am coming to you tonight from cold and snow covered Indiana. Thank you all for joining us for our third lecture in the fall lecture series. I hope you are all staying warm as we open up this evening of church history. Now, joining me are my co hosts and familiar faces, hopefully to you all. That's Peter Smith and Wendy Eaton. Peter serves as a board member for the Historic Sites Foundation, and Wendy serves as the administrative assistant for the foundation and the assistant archivist for Community of Christ. Welcome, Peter and Wendy. It's so good to see you again. Now, friends, there's a few announcements that I'd like to share with you tonight. Allow me to do a quick screen share. Our friends at Liberty Hall will be hosting a special Sunday school program for kids K through 12 this coming Sunday, November 24th, from 9 a.m. to 10:30 a.m. The morning program will also include a visit from Joseph Smith III and his daughter, Audentia. It's going to be an exciting morning. No RSVP needed. If you and any child from kindergarten through the 12th grade is interested, come on by Liberty Hall. Again, it's this Sunday from 9 a.m. to 10:30 a.m. They are also getting ready at Liberty Hall for their annual Christmas tea that will be held on Sunday, December 8th. So all are welcome to gather at Joseph Smith III's Liberty Hall in Lamoni, Iowa for an afternoon of holiday treats, music, crafts, stories, and so much more. There'll be activities for youth of all ages and even the adults. If you've already been to a Christmas tea at Liberty Hall, that doesn't mean that you can't come again. This is an annual tradition. It changes every year, but is always wonderful. And also no RSVP needed. So if you're in the Lamoni area on Sunday, December 8th, please stop by and have yourself a treat and sing a hymn. We are equally excited to announce that our annual fall campaign is in full swing here at the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation. As the year draws to a close, we turn our hopes to the future as the Historic Sites Foundation looks to expand its mission of preserving and sharing church heritage. Your gifts to the fall campaign will support many things, but to name a few, it will support the expansion of our popular online lectures like tonight and give birth to a new hands-on history program that that really explores the variety of ways to preserve local and global Community of Christ heritage. In addition to hosting our popular annual bus tour, which you can see an image of the tour in Italy at a Waldensian temple, your campaign gift will support a number of new educational programs in 2025, like special weekend events and walking tours for visitors of all ages to experience church history in the places where it actually happened. Your campaign gift also supports the expansion of the Alma Blair internship program to include new opportunities for young adults to preserve the past through oral history interviews, through processing archival collections, documenting field history, and breaking new ground on archaeological investigations at Liberty Hall. We can't forget that your gifts go a long way too to preserve the historic structures and the historic landscapes where church history happened. Places like Liberty Hall and Heritage Plaza in Independence, and of course, the historic Plano Stone Church. So, giving to the fall campaign can be done in three easy ways. You can see the QR code on the screen, and Wendy will drop the online donation link and mailing address into the chat. Your generosity as we prepare for the new year will help us continue to do a number of things, like hosting bus tours and youth caravans at these historic sites, in addition to hosting more online programs that share Community of Christ's rich heritage. I can't thank you enough, friends, for your support in helping lift up the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation. Tonight's speaker is not only a great storyteller, he is often the face of Community of Christ Historic Sites, none other than our friend Lachlan Mackay. Lach is a past president of the John Whitmer Historical Association, and now he serves in the Community of Christ Council of 12 Apostles, where he oversees the Northeast USA mission field. His additional assignments include serving as the director of the historic sites and lead for the church history and sacred story team for Community of Christ. He received a bachelor's in economics and Russian area studies from the University of Missouri, Columbia. He's also a published author, as his past publications have focused on Kirtland Temple, the Smith family properties in Nauvoo, and the visual image of Joseph Smith Jr., including the most recent work on the Smith-Larsen daguerreotype, which he featured about a year ago, last November. If you haven't seen that lecture, I encourage you to check it out on our website as well as our YouTube channel. But enough about the daguerreotype. Tonight's lecture is called Making Peace with the Past, Community of Christ's Response to New Mormon History. Welcome, Lach. I'll hand the spotlight over to you. I'm done stuttering and getting through these opening remarks. You must make me so nervous with an apostle on hand that I can't get through what I need to say. So the spotlight, my friend, is all yours.
Thank you, Barb. Sorry for making you nervous, and it is wonderful to be back with all of you this evening. Community of Christ's journey with New Mormon history got off to a rocky start. Late in the summer of 1943, Fawn, Mackay, Brodie arrived in Independence, Missouri. Brodie's encounter with the reorganization are carefully documented in Newell Bringhurst's 1992, The Renegade and the Reorganites. Fawn M. Brodie and her varied encounters with the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Brodie arrived in Missouri fresh off a visit to the library archives of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Salt Lake City. Ironically, she first learned about Mormonism's past with polygamy from an RLDS missionary while visiting Nauvoo as a college student in the 1930s, and while in Salt Lake, she asked to see sources on Nauvoo polygamy. This angered her uncle, LDS Apostle David O. Mackay, who forbade her from doing further research in the collections of the church, a position he quickly reconsidered, but Brodie did not accept his offer to return. Her experience while researching in Independence over 10 days in September couldn't have been more different. Former RLDS historian Samuel Burgess welcomed Fawn. Writing later to friend and historian Dale Morgan, Brodie said Burgess, quote, opened the library vault to me and sharing piles of material without my even asking for it. I saw a good many original letters, the photostatic copy of the Book of Mormon manuscript, the original manuscript, the inspired translation of the Bible, the Hiram Page seer stone, several of Joseph Smith's own books, and a good deal of printed materials, end quote. She also noted that the RLDS Church appeared to be, quote, shockingly poor, and that the Emma Hale Memorial Library was, quote, a fiction, with the catalog, quote, impossible to use, and the books and manuscripts divided between a vault in one building, probably located in Bartholomew Hall, you've seen here, and a dark corner in another, she said, 2 blocks away. I was strangely excited to discover, this is me, that the dark corner Fawn described was likely the former Joseph Luff home, the house Kristen and I now live in, of course, where I'm now sitting in Independence after transitioning from Nauvoo in May. Although Brodie questioned the abilities of Samuel Burgess as a librarian, she said that she, quote, had to rely on him for everything, end quote, and appreciated, quote, his astonishing willingness to think up things I might be interested in. Otherwise, the trip would have been an utter waste, end quote. While in Independence, Brodie was introduced to RLDS leaders, including President Frederick M. Smith, grandson of Joseph Smith Jr., seen here as he landed in Hawaii, 1929, and Israel A. Smith, Fred's brother and future president. She took away, quote, a very deep conviction that the Utah Church benefited enormously by losing the Joseph Smith heirs. She wrote, they're interesting, intelligent people with a good deal of social presence, but they are such typical American bourgeois businessmen that the thought of a halo above any one of them is immediately incongruous. After conversing with Frederick and Israel, his brother, I felt that neither deifies his grandfather to nearly the extent that the average Utah Mormon does. They, meaning Fred and Israel, are inclined to be a little apologetic, and they are definitely on the defensive, end quote. When it came to polygamy, Fred M. and Israel had inherited their defensiveness from their father, Joseph Smith III, and Brodie recognized her indebtedness to the Reorganites. It was Joseph III's 1880s attempts to clear his father of any connection to the doctrine that resulted in the many Utah affidavits with details of events occurring 40 years earlier. Brodie noted that without these, she would have known nothing about Joseph's polygamous marriages. They proved to be both a blessing and a burden, however, with Fawn writing, quote, "It's the old problem of being smothered in affidavits. If the damned Reorganites weren't in existence, I wouldn't have to worry so much about documentation. But then I wouldn't have so many documents either," end quote. These affidavits proved to be troubling for the reorganization as well, although the expected faults of memory regarding events when 4 decades removed allowed them to be satisfactorily impeached in the minds of many RLDS members. Joseph Smith III said and did many things I admire when it comes to church history. When asked about placing a copy from his own library of John C. Bennett's expose on Mormonism of the library of the Illinois Historical Society, Joseph replied, quote, "I'm not a fool. I know well enough that that book and others like it are in existence. I would not suppress a single portion of any evidence for or against the movement known as Mormonism. Let the whole story be told and every fact that can be found and proved brought to light. I'm willing to let the decision be made upon that basis. I am not afraid of the truth, nor of a book like that, for it is a pack of lies," end quote. Although I appreciate his willingness to make the sources available, I also acknowledge Joseph III's blind spot, passed to following generations as well, when it came to polygamy. Joseph III appointed Heman C. Smith, RLDS apostle, and grandson of Lyman White, to compile a multi-volume history of the church. The first 4 volumes were published in 1896, 6 years before B.H. Roberts issued in Salt Lake the first volume of what would become commonly known as the Documentary History of the Church. Also under the leadership of Joseph III, the Journal of History was introduced in 1908, a quarterly whose run would continue until 1925. In his introduction to the periodical, Heman C. Smith stresses his commitment to an honest interpretation of the past. Quote, "It is not the province of a historian always to record pleasant things. The faithful historian must record the events as they have happened, though he may sometimes devoutly wish that the event he is called upon to chronicle had never happened. But if he withhold it, he deprives his reader and those who have trusted him to do his work of one of the means of development and one of the defenses against error, and thus proves false to his trust," end quote. The RLDS response to the 1945 publication of the results of Brodie's research, No Man Knows My History, The Life of Joseph Smith, did not live up to these sentiments. Most members and leaders simply couldn't believe that Joseph was a polygamist, because he himself repeatedly said he was not. To admit that he was would also require admitting that he wasn't telling the truth. After obtaining a pre-publication copy of the book, Israel A. Smith worked to stall the book's release long enough for an RLDS rebuttal to be prepared, and Israel, a lawyer, went so far as to write to Alfred A. Knopf and suggest legal action was being considered for damages to both the church and the Smith family. Israel seemed particularly annoyed by Fawn's efforts to portray Joseph as the father of children from other than Emma, and by the suggestion that Emma knocked Eliza R. Snow down a set of stairs, causing her to miscarry Joseph's child. I'm sympathetic to Israel's positions on these 2 matters, although not on the larger question of Joseph's involvement in plural marriage. Although I have no documentation to back this up, my sense is that No Man Knows My History was not a bestseller in RLDS circles. Even Robert or Bob Flanders, who would go on to write Nauvoo, Kingdom on the Mississippi, was not initially a fan, saying in 1962, quote, "It seems to be the unhappy fact that irresponsible and even profligate accounts of the past, written often to satisfy present anxieties or passions by people like Mrs. Brodie, who was a polemicist rather than a historian, should prejudice many against historical investigators and their work," end quote. Bob noted in his 1973 address at the first annual JWHA conference, John Whitmer Conference in Nauvoo, Illinois, quote, Never did an author profess greater indifference to religion and betray greater interest in the subject than Fawn, Brodie in No Man Knows My History, end quote. He goes on to say that, quote, the 1945 publication of Fawn and Brodie's No Man Knows My History was a landmark. Certainly not all the work published earlier should be called old history, and neither is the reverse true. However, Brodie's famous and influential biography of Joseph Smith clearly defined both old and new, and so is a transitional work. A new era dawned with her book, end quote. Interestingly, Moses Richardson, who coined the term New Mormon History in a March 1969 article in the American West, did not include Brodie in his survey of practitioners. Flanders did make his list, though. Baum himself was fundamentally changed while writing Kingdom in the early 1960s, having a faith crisis lasting some 15 years before becoming inactive in 1978 and formally withdrawing from the RLDS Church in 1984. I won't be attempting to catalog RLDS contributions to New Mormon history, but I can't not mention a critically important example that predated Flanders' work before turning my attention back to Flanders. James E. Lancaster's 1962 Saints Herald article, By the Gift and Power of God, argued that Joseph Smith Jr. translated the Book of Mormon using a seer stone in the bottom of the hat. William D. Russell argues that this and other articles like it challenging traditional RLDS views led to a change in editorial policy at the Herald. By the late 1960s, controversial topics were avoided in the Herald. This, in turn, resulted in the creation of Courage, a journal of history, thought, and action by faculty members at Graceland College, a short-lived but influential journal that focused on history and theology. Flanders' 1965 Nauvoo, Kingdom on the Mississippi, was among the first books on Mormon history to be published by University Press. According to Bob's obituary, it has never been out of print. I realize that the source is biased, but we ordered and sold thousands of copies at the Joseph Smith Historic Site over decades with no interruption, so I think it's probably true. Kingdom is a political and economic history of Nauvoo, linking Joseph to rituals later associated with the Nauvoo Temple, the political kingdom of God, the Council of 50, and polygamy, which made it very uncomfortable reading for many Reorganites. Paul Edwards offered a positive review of the book in the 1966 Herald, and it's mentioned in a review of the first issue of Dialogue by Bill Russell, also in 1966, and both prior to a change in editorial policy by the presidency to avoid controversy in the Herald. Outside of the pages of the Herald, Kingdom was getting lots of attention, with intellectual Evelyn Burgess, daughter of Samuel, commenting that, quote, blood pressures are rising all over the church, end quote. The book seems not to be discussed in the Herald again until 1970, when Dick Howard brings it up. Quote, when Robert Flanders wrote his book, Nauvoo, Kingdom on the Mississippi, the reaction to that book was both positive and negative. The negative response was so strong and unchristian that for a time it looked as if historical research would forever be doomed to the status of an underground activity. Some of the people who objected most strongly to the book never read it and wouldn't dare open it. In recent years, we have found, as we have studied the book a little more closely, and even making allowance for Dr. Flanders' heavy reliance on some Utah sources, that it is a landmark in our church historiography, which should bless the people of this church and of other churches too, with a more humane understanding of our Latter-day Saint predecessors at Nauvoo, end quote. Following a rocky start, Kingdom continued to grow in acceptance, and under the careful tutelage of Alma Blair and his professorial successors at the Joseph Smith Historic Site, it was the Nauvoo Bible for interns, me included, for more than 40 years. I stand here tonight because of that book. Although raised in the church, it was the story it told that converted me. I was captured by it, as were hundreds of other young adults who went on to become leaders at various levels in the church. Long summer evenings in Nauvoo spent with Alma as he taught us to think historically have also been critically important in helping us and those we offer ministry to see the past not as enemy, but as friend. Another critically important earliest example of New Mormon history is Richard Howard's Restoration Restoration Scriptures, a study in textual development. This 1969 publication looked at changes between manuscripts and the various printed editions of the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, and an inspired version of the Bible. In the process, Dick made a new and compelling argument that revelation was conceptual rather than literal. With a master's in history from the University of California at Berkeley, Dick was the first professionally trained church historian, and he brought a new spirit of openness to the archives. BYU's Robert Matthews had been asking to see the original manuscripts for the inspired version or new translation for years, and he was always told by Dick's predecessor, no. When Bob wrote Dick for the first time and Dick replied with a yes, Bob thought to himself, quote, he certainly doesn't understand, end quote. He called to clarify, but no clarification was needed, and Bob was working with the collection by June of 1968. With the encouragement of the RLDS First Presidency, Dick began to research the origins of Nauvoo polygamy in 1977. His findings were published in 1983, although significantly diluted at the request of the presidency. This is perhaps what Dick's referring to in 1993 when writing, none of the top RLDS leaders, but with perhaps one or two isolated exceptions during the early 1980s, have ever pressured me to write history to justify the RLDS Church's existence. They have been supportive of historical scholarship generally, even though most of them devote little time to a formal academic study, end quote. Even though Dick's research was diluted as presented, his publication of The Changing RLDS Response to Mormon Polygamy, a preliminary analysis, reportedly, and I need to confirm this with Dick, led to personal attacks, including attacks on family members and trash being dumped in the yard, and resulted in the First Presidency issuing an official statement in response to the publication of news reports in which they argue that the article, quote, does not claim that Joseph Smith Jr. was directly responsible for the practice of polygamy, that he ever practiced polygamy himself, or that it was among the authorized beliefs and practices of the church in Nauvoo, end quote. A year later, the Rich Hill District in Missouri submitted a World Conference resolution with resolve statements requiring the official position of the church to be that Joseph had no involvement in authoring, practicing, or promoting polygamy, and restricting church administrative officers' public pronouncements on polygamy to the same position. That resolution did not pass. It would be 26 years before a Herald Publishing House imprint, David Hallett, Barbara Walden, and John Hamer's 2010 Community of Christ and Illustrated History would explicitly link Joseph Smith Jr. to the practice of polygamy. Although the term New Mormon History was familiar to the fringe dwellers, our predecessors who attended JWHA and MHA and read dialogue, it wasn't introduced to the general RLDS membership until Paul Edwards wrote about it in the October 1986 Saints Herald. He described it as, quote, a desire to be more objective, more professional, more holistic in approach, to meet the questions, the doubts, the issues of the past head on, and to do so with both faith and integrity, end quote. In the same essay, Edwards credits Brodie with starting this new approach to Mormon history and describes her biography of Joseph as, quote, an open, honest, generally objective, yet strangely limited account. Her position has often been misunderstood and her motives seriously questioned, but she raised the significant questions of Mormonism as a new religious experience in the Western religious world, end quote. Although most Community of Christ denomination leaders had at least some familiarity with the more complex elements of our early history, and both the approach of New Mormon history and examples of it received favorable coverage in the pages of the Saints Herald, it became clear by 2008 that more needed to be done to help the general membership catch up with recent scholarship. With FLDS leader Warren Jeffs regularly in the headlines, and HBO's Emmy and Golden Globe nominated Big Love injecting polygamy into popular culture across the nation, questions about the origin of the practice were becoming more common in the church. Launched in January of 2007, Mitt Romney's campaign for US president further elevated interest in the history of the early church. Community of Christ members and leaders were increasingly confronted with questions from neighbors and the press about obscure events or doctrines, many of which were either never part of our theology, and some of which occurred after the 1844 branching of the family tree. I ended up developing and presenting a PowerPoint in 2008 titled Caught in the Crossfire to try and provide local leaders with the tools necessary to understand and respond to the questions. And I was the sacrificial lamb picked by the first presidency to meet with a Kansas City television news reporter on camera to respond to questions about Jackson County, Missouri as the Garden of Eden. I desperately wanted to say that I grew up in Jackson County and it's nice, but it's no Garden of Eden. I knew that to do so, though, would mean that I and my church would make the cut and be featured on both the 6 and 10 newscasts. And what I consider to be a triumph, I restrained myself, and there was no mention of Community of Christ in the story that aired that night. Against this backdrop of significantly increased awareness of and questions about church history, Community of Christ World Church historian Mark A. Shear's 3-volume church history was beginning to take shape. Mark initially pitched the idea for an updated history of the church to President W. Grant McMurray, himself a former assistant church historian, in 2003. Significant developments occurred in the life of the church since Richard Howard's 2-volume The Church Through the Years was published in the early 1990s, including, most importantly, a new name for the denomination. Other changes, though, included increased diversity among the leading quorums and major jurisdictional reorganization. President McMurray anticipated a 1-volume history, but as the work progressed, Mark argued successfully for a 2nd volume. Grant resigned in 2004 and was succeeded by Stephen M. Veazey in 2005. This transition exposed conflicting expectations for the project. According to Mark, Steve, with his background as a longtime apostle and president of the Council of 12, viewed a short, heavily illustrated, easily translated public history as much more helpful than a multi-volume academic history. Despite these differences of opinion, Mark was able to secure permission for the project to continue and even got Steve's support for a 3rd volume. It was becoming increasingly clear to Steve and other leaders that the gap between New Mormon history and the understandings of the general membership needed to be bridged before the publication of Mark's 1st volume. Steve explained it this way, quote, "Although I have read many church history books, I always want to know more about my religious ancestors and the historical contexts in which they expressed their faith. While I was much more than casually aware of church history previously, since beginning my presidency of the church, I've engaged in an extensive study of our story. I've explored books and articles from a wide spectrum of scholars, authors, and publishers, ranging from the faithful to the skeptical and in between. Truth has nothing to fear from scrutiny. The apologetic approach to church history, presenting our story in as favorable a light as possible, is not sufficient for the journey ahead. That approach does not evidence the integrity that must be fundamental to our witness and ministry. I've come to see more clearly how God's Spirit worked in the lives of imperfect but highly dedicated people. As the first presidency has joined with others in exploring issues emerging from the ongoing study of restoration history, we have decided it would be timely to provide a set of church history principles to help guide the church's reflections and discussions. These insights have been distilled from the insights of past and present world church leaders, church historians, theologians, and others, end quote. Steve then introduced 9 church history principles, which he drafted after extensive discussions with Mark and with input on the draft from Mark and others, including Dick Howard, who was especially helpful in finding ways to articulate the intended message. I'm going to share a significantly abbreviated form of these for the sake of time. Number 1, continuing exploration of our history is part of identity formation. As a church, we seek always to clarify our identity, message, and mission. Number 2, history informs but does not dictate our faith and beliefs. Number 3, the church encourages honest, responsible historical scholarship. This process should avoid presentism or interpreting the past based on current worldview and culture instead of the culture of the time. Number 4, the study of church history is a continuing or unfolding journey. If we say that a book on history is the only true telling of the story, we risk canonizing one version, a tendency we have shown in the past. Number 5, seeing both the faithfulness and human flaws in our history makes it more believable and realistic, not less. Number 6, the responsible study of church history involves learning, repentance, and transformation. Number 7, the church has a long-standing tradition that it does not legislate or mandate positions on matters of church history. Number 8, we need to create a respectful culture of dialogue about matters of history. And number 9, our faith is grounded in God's revelation in Jesus Christ and the continuing guidance of the Holy Spirit. In addition to the creation of the church history principles, in preparation for the release of Mark's book, a decision was made to emphasize the academic nature of the work by publishing it under a newly created imprint, Community of Christ Seminary Press. It would also be used in 2013 for Dale E. Luffman's The Book of Mormon's Witness to His First Readers, which places the book in a 19th century context, and for Alan Tyree's 2013 Millions Call It Scripture, The Book of Mormon in the 21st Century. The creation of the new imprint created some distance, although not much, between the books and the First Presidency that wouldn't have existed if they were issued under the banner of Herald House, the church press. Focused on research and writing, Mark was surprised to discover after his first 2 volumes were in print that the imprint used was not Herald House, and that the books included a disclaimer that the quote, the author's methods and conclusions do not necessarily reflect official positions held by the church, the seminary, or other church-related institutions, end quote, a reflection of the fact that the church doesn't take official positions on matters of history. Preparation for the introduction of Journey of a People included a decision by the First Presidency to delay the release of Volume 1, covering 1820 to 44, so Volume 2, covering 44 to 46, 1946, could come out at the same time. This was frustrating to Mark, but would allow time for the history principles to be integrated into the life of the church, and for church leaders, some of whom were not as familiar with the early story, to fully process the material before it was introduced to the general membership. This decision also reflected the belief among some in leadership that Mark should have started with the period covered in Volume 2. Much of Volume 1 reviews the findings of scholars writing New Mormon history over the previous decades, and its greatest contribution is compiling it in one place. Very little attention had been paid to the post-assassination dark and cloudy day, as it's often called in the reorganization, the early years of the new organization, and the reorganization under Joseph Smith III and Frederick M. Smith. Even less work had been done on the history of the church during the second half of the 20th century. Issuing the first and second volumes at the same time provided the opportunity for members to access the part of the story that leaders believed were most relevant to the church today, Joseph Smith III's 54 years of leadership, as he crafted us into moderate Mormons, who were most definitely not Mormon if asked, while reclaiming the emphasis on peace found in the first few years of the 1830s, but soon consumed by the frontier culture of violence. I found it to be an interesting exercise to view the earliest response to Joseph's involvement in polygamy, including the carefully orchestrated rolling out of Mark's Volume 1, through a layman's take on the Kubler-Ross model of the stages of grief. Any psychiatrists, psychologists out there, I know you're shuddering, I apologize, but I thought this was a fun exercise for me anyway to go through. So the model includes denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Although some early members and leaders argued that Joseph was involved, repented, and should be forgiven, The prevailing understanding by the 1980s regarding polygamy was denial. Joseph didn't do it. After all, to admit that he did would require either admitting or ignoring his failure to tell the truth about it. As additional source material surfaced and found its way to readers in various communities at different times, denial became anger. In the Araldist tradition, this emotion starts to become more common in the 1980s and is especially noticeable during and after the 1990s. It can also often be seen in new Community of Christ members with roots in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, where it's expressed, as well as in Community of Christ, as ridicule and hostility towards Joseph. Some members get stuck in this stage, but others eventually transition into bargaining, with efforts to understand Nauvoo polygamy in the context of 19th century communalism, explore Joseph's efforts to extricate himself from the practice prior to his death, or frame it as potentially an unintended consequence of the introduction of eternal marriage. Depression is closely intertwined with bargaining and acceptance, and in this example, it manifested as putting our past, both tragic and triumphant, on a shelf, walking out of the room, and closing the door behind us. It's complicated, but I believe this is one of the factors that resulted in an RLDS identity crisis during the last decades of the 20th century and in the first decades of the 21st century. Recognizing the void, members of our church history community began discussing whether it might be possible to gather people together to intentionally reconstruct a historically accurate and theologically sound story of the church. Naively and irrationally, I was a little angry at people like Bob Flanders and Alma Blair. Strangely, not Dick Howard. He's way too nice to be mad at. Bob and Alma are among my heroes, but I blame them and others for deconstructing our foundational myths, but not engaging in the hard work of re-mythologizing. I know that it was not their job, but it's rather the job of denominational leaders. I also now realize that denominational leaders often don't know the story well enough, and they're not able to keep up on current scholarship sufficiently enough to engage in that process on their own. We gathered leading minds of the church from the communities of our historians and theologians at Graceland University's Independence campus in the early 2000s to start this discussion. Somehow I managed to slip in as well. We began to explore what it might look like to re-mythologize or intentionally recreate a historically accurate and theologically sound story of the church. It soon became clear that the discussion was premature as participants, not most, but some, continued to deconstruct the story like vultures picking at the last few pieces of flesh on a rotting carcass. The failure of this attempt caused me to wonder if intentional identity formation was even possible, a question I pondered as I attended Spectacular to teach church history. SPEC is a gathering for Community of Christ youth and friends held every summer at Graceland University. And James Mulholland, then a Quaker minister from Indianapolis, was there that year as a guest minister. I don't remember how the topic of identity formation came up, but Jim was confident that it was possible in a denominational context, but it required three things: art, story, and song. I was captured by this thought, and it's becoming increasingly significant in the years that followed, with the implementation being driven by church leaders who are not necessarily aware of this larger strategy. For example, Community of Christ Sings, a new church hymnal with an emphasis on the pursuit of peace, was introduced in 2013. As described by David Hallett, the hymnal includes 664 songs, half of them new to the community, and a common core repertoire of over 100 entries translated into English, French, and Spanish. The hope is that these songs, as they become familiar and beloved in the church around the world, will help knit us back together as the incredibly diverse membership and theology has pulled us apart in some ways since the 1960s. As has been the case since the reorganization in the mid-19th century, we are comfortable borrowing hymns from our Protestant cousins, but the hymnal also includes expressions of the restoration, like the Spirit of God, Redeemer of Israel, and we thank thee, O God, for our prophets. Our LDS favorites like There's an Old Path are included as well. David notes, quote, The so-called moderate Mormon identity that historian Roger Launius felt was dying 20 years ago, which is now over 30, surprisingly seems to have perdured. The Community of Christ is still neither fully Protestant nor fully Mormon. And that end quote from David. While the new hymnal was being created, introduced, and incorporated into the life of the church around the world, there's also been a growing focus on storytelling. The church history team was renamed the Church History and Sacred Story Team in 2016, and the Community Christ Historic Sites Foundation, under the direction of Barb Walden, has introduced programs like Share Your Object, Share Your Story, so members can share church-related artifacts and explain why they are important in their lives. Other storyteller-themed programs focus on short videos about important people or events, or longer online and in-person gatherings, some filling an evening with one guest and others lasting a weekend with 2 or 3 featured storytellers, followed by an invitation for all to share. When all goes as planned, this form of public history both translates academic history into a more easily understandable form and allows the general membership to participate in the historical process at some level, while also reinforcing themes of peace, generosity, and compassion when they occur in our history, and occasionally by recognizing those times when we fell short on those goals. Our focus on storytelling will soon get a boost, with President Prophet Designate Stacey Cram intensely interested and supportive of these efforts. While significant progress has been made on the story and song components of identity formation, we're lagging in the creation of art or visuals. Our church seal, inspired by Isaiah 11, verse 6, and featured in a lion, lamb, and child, along with the word peace, is by far our most significant formational art. Designed as a corporate seal in the early 1870s by a committee of 3, led by Joseph Smith III, this image slowly morphed into the visual representation of the church. Church artist Jack Garnier and talented and passionate members like Henry Inouye were prolific recreators of important scenes from our history, but both have now passed. Using very different methods, John Hamer's icons representing the enduring principles, Community Christ 9 Who We Are statements, are the most significant formational identifiers of the 21st century. But we are in desperate need of a new generation of artists to join with John. In the meantime, I'm hopeful that an AI image generator like ChatGPT's DALL-E will soon be good enough that someone with no artistic ability, but who can type, like me, will be able to create helpful graphics. There's still sometimes a disconnect on church history between leaders and members who engage at the mission center and denominational level, and those whose experience is limited by chance or choice to isolated congregations. Earlier this year, I encountered a longtime member who was struggling after hearing, for the first time, opinions on Joseph Smith, polygamy, and Book of Mormon historicity that doesn't align with the things they learned decades before I was born. These occurrences are less and less common as the years go by. I'm not yet ready to declare that peace with the past has been achieved, but efforts and intentional identity formation built on the foundation of song and hopefully art are paying dividends. Most important is the growing emphasis on storytelling, including the interpretation of academic history into the language of public history that the general membership can comprehend and that celebrates our successes and recognizes our failures. I also can't overstate the importance of the church history principles in this process. They have been incredibly consequential in the life of the church, supporting longtime members and newly confirmed adherents as they seek to balance history, faith, and belief in new and healthy ways. They provide a helpful lens for viewing, processing, and understanding the past, and encourage the uncoupling of history and theology. They have been so meaningful to seekers struggling to reconcile history and faith that we printed them as a tract to distribute at historic sites. It's taken us almost 80 years since Fawn Brodie launched the era of New Mormon history, and we haven't quite achieved peace yet, but I can confidently declare that a ceasefire is in effect and holding, or it was, and then the world ended. It felt like my world ended anyway. Community of Christ is transparent regarding our finances and have been even more so over the last 8 years as we faced pressing financial needs as our members in North America, Australia, and Europe age out, and Christianity struggles to find relevancy among young adults in these places. At the same time, the church is growing in the global south and has significant potential for the future if we can fund it. Since 2016, the presiding bishop publicly and repeatedly stated that everything was on the table as we worked to secure our future, although many members likely interpreted that to mean everything but Kirtland Temple is on the table. There was considerable concern among leaders that a historic sites sale might break the soul of the church. Faced with yet another reduction of an already skeletal staff, this one on the magnitude of 30% or so of the remaining employees, and seeing no other path forward, we made the gut-wrenching decision to sell in 2023, with both closing and the announcement of the transaction occurring on 5 March 2024. As an introvert, I hate talking about myself, but I made an exception regarding the sale. My grandmother was Lois Smith Larson, a daughter of President Frederick Madison Smith and granddaughter of Joseph Smith III. I grew up attending Smith family reunions in Nauvoo and Independence, but it wasn't until after university that I fell in love with our story. Following several summer internships, I ended up as director of the Kirtland Temple Historic Site and spent 15 years living literally in the shadow of Kirtland Temple. I moved to Nauvoo in 2007 and lived on the Joseph Smith Historic Site for 18 years. These places were my home for almost my entire adult life. I met my wife, Kristen, in the red brick store in Nauvoo and was ordained to my first and favorite priesthood office, teacher, in Kirtland Temple. I'm almost certainly the only person living who is ordained in both the Kirtland and Independence temples, and I have almost certainly given more tours of Kirtland Temple than any living person. The Nauvoo House, Homestead, and Mansion House are my ancestral homes. For me, the discussions and decision to part with these places was emotionally, spiritually, and physically devastating, with the stress throwing me into AFib for the first and hopefully only time ever on March 4th, the day before the announcement. We had 45 days from closing to move both sites, and then we packed our own household to move to Independence, Missouri. As an aside, we just bought a house. We are now working on our 4th move of the year. There was a time when I thought that the sale might break me. If I inherited anything from Joseph Smith III, though, it's his pragmatism, and intellectually, the path forward was clear. I care deeply about our past, but I care even more about our future. The post-pandemic world has changed. The needs have never been greater, and Community Christ no longer had the resources, human or financial, to care for those places. We were killing ourselves trying to care for those places the way they deserve to be cared for. Some of you have perhaps already heard a few of my thoughts on the sale. A video version was briefly popular on YouTube, an extraordinarily uncomfortable experience for an introvert. Also uncomfortable, but at the same time incredibly kind, were strangers who stopped by my house in Nauvoo with gifts of food, or who, in recognizing me in public spaces in Kirtland or Nauvoo, apologized for the pain the sale caused. I was expecting a different response from Community of Christ members, many of whom were angry and grieving following the sale. As I traveled this summer to our annual reunions or family camps and traveled this fall to Mission Center conferences, I met angry folks, but they were not angry with me. I experienced only empathy and grace. I think after seeing the video, people simply felt sorry for me. To be clear, the sale was not about severing connection, not about severing our branch of the common trunk that is the 14 years of the church. It is not about rejecting Joseph Smith Jr. or Nauvoo or the Book of Mormon, and it is certainly not about rejecting Kirtland Temple. We sold the property, paper, and portraits, but we didn't sell our story. And a reaction that is surprising, but in hindsight shouldn't have been, members are suddenly passionate about our past and the lessons that we can learn from it. In the more than 30 years with historic sites, I have never experienced a greater level of interest in history from members or support from church leaders than I am experiencing now. Our summer intern program continues now at Joseph Smith III's Liberty Hall in Lamona, Iowa, and in the archives in Independence, Missouri, and it will soon expand. I'm now able to travel around the world to teach church history to members who would never be able to visit the sites. My next trip has been planned for Zambia in February. Inspired by the sale, I'm writing for the first time on a topic outside of the 19th century, and I hope others will do the same, and that we will look beyond the story of the church in the U.S. $2 million from the proceeds of the sale have been placed in an investment fund to help support the work of Barbara Walden and the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation. To clarify, they're only going to spend the interest at 3 or 4% spend rate, so we still need your financial support. But that was a wonderful boost that they will have the interest on those funds available to support the work that Barb and the foundation are doing. So they focus on preserving our remaining historic sites and sharing church history through activities like a tour of the church history sites in Italy this past October. Stacy Cram has assigned herself the task of working directly with the church history team if she is sustained as prophet president in June of 25 at our next World Conference. And that same church history team has been asked to plan and conduct the opening worship service at World Conference. Like many in Community of Christ, I continue to grieve the sale, but I am also extraordinarily excited about our future. It is clear to me that our history is not a thing of the past.
Thank you, Lach. Thank you for, as always, sharing your insight into the Community of Christ past, but also diving into the present. Thank you for having the courage to be vulnerable to talk about your own personal experiences, uncomfortable as that must have been in front of over 100 people this evening. I appreciate hearing your story, and I know so many who have joined us tonight really appreciated hearing things from your perspective, and especially from your personal experience. So as our audience prepares to load the queue with questions, and I can see there's already a number of them, I can't help but connect your closing thoughts to that of what we're doing today. At the beginning, I mentioned the fall campaign and raising funds to help get us through the new year and all that we have planned. As you shared tonight, you talked about, in the end, a lot of hope for the future, that history is about the past, absolutely, but that you're equally excited about the new year and what's in front of you and preserving the past. So what you shared about church history today was made possible by so many of our generous contributors, like a dream realized in many ways over the last few years. So as you look to the new year, what are you dreaming and hoping for as far as the future of church history?
I am so very excited. I'm particularly excited about some wonderful things happening at Liberty Hall and some future programming. Still in the works, too early to announce a date, but at Liberty Hall, which I've long thought was our best restoration and is now our flagship historic site, Liberty Hall is in the early stages of talking to other stakeholders in Lamoni about adopting a program that started in Nauvoo decades ago. It was called Untold Nauvoo Stories in Nauvoo. Of course, it will be Untold Lamoni Stories. And it is an opportunity for people to come together for a weekend, both professional historians and amateurs, to tell stories that have not been told before. And, you know, we've been doing this in Nauvoo for decades. We have not run out of stories yet. And I'm pretty confident that Lamoni is going to have even more stories than Nauvoo. It's a bigger town. So I am really excited about that possibility and the wonderful work that Paul DeBarth and a very dedicated team of volunteers are doing there. I'm also really excited that the oral history program continues to grow. We're talking about bringing on an oral history intern to help Megan Edvilson, our oral history specialist. We're starting to talk more about international histories, and we've realized that we need to do a much better job at capturing the stories of Black American Community Christ members. That's something that we have not done a great job on. So we're focused on that. I'm very, very excited there. And I can't help but be excited, having just returned from Plano at our foundation board meetings for the weekend. We all have only so much capacity. And I got to say that Kirtland and Nauvoo took a lot of my capacity. And so suddenly to be able to dive into Lamoni and Plano stories, we have amazing history in Plano. And the Stowe Church is incredible. And I'm already excited about ways that we might be able to, I don't want to be careful, but I would love to make it look a little more inside as it did, coming up with creative ways to partner with the community to use it. The Chicago Mission Center is doing some wonderful work with Plano and with Kendall County on ways that collectively we might be able to better utilize some of those spaces. And I just love the opportunity to dive into the Plano story. It is so meaningful and so overlooked. So I'll stop there, but it is the worst of times and the best of times all at the same time. I don't know how to process this, but I'm so excited about what's in front of us. How about you, Barb? What are you excited about?
I thought this was a night for you to answer questions.
I like making you uncomfortable.
And you do such a good job of it. But no, this isn't an uncomfortable question. I appreciate your contagious energy. This has been a devastating year for church history enthusiasts and especially us at the historic sites. So to be ending the year in a spirit of optimism and enthusiasm, like you've shared, just within the last 10 minutes, is really astonishing. It's a year of loss, but it's also a year of thinking outside of the box and exploring new programs that is really exciting. So just like you mentioned, the possibility of things in Lamoni, I think of special events that we're talking about hosting at the historic places. Next Palm Sunday, we're spending the weekend in Kirtland and inviting people to join us to explore the history of Kirtland as a history of hope, and exploring walking tours of the historic cemetery that's in the shadows of the Kirtland Temple and in the neighborhoods surrounding the Kirtland Temple, programs that we just didn't have the capacity or funding to do before. So I'm excited about going back to our historic places and looking at it through a different perspective, as well as new hands-on opportunities. And then, of course, there's always the expansion of the internship program. I mean, you and I would not even be here tonight if it wasn't for the Alma Blair internship program. And I think about all the incredible things the alums from that program are doing, many of them coming on as guest historians in our online lectures. But the thought of having more of these interns working in the archives, working as field historians, digging up Liberty Hall's backyard with Paul DeBarth in an archaeological dig. I mean, that's incredible. So I feel like we're going to be learning and uncovering history at a much faster rate moving into the new year. And I can't help but be excited about that. And even listening to your presentation tonight, we've got to dig into that art. I mean, we've done story well, we've done music well. It sounds like we need to tap into the artist community to better capture the past and the present. So you've given us a lot of homework tonight.
So you reminded me of something else I'm incredibly excited about. If any of my colleagues are listening, sorry for not talking to you in advance, but I am really excited about field historians. This idea of young scholars. This is very early in the planning stages, who will have funding to travel with church leaders, apostles, and others into fields around the world and capture stories. And my hope is that that will result in the kind of thing that David Howlett did with the history of the church in the Philippines and the history of the church in India, that we're going to be able to do more of those kinds of things. with the foundation's generous financial support, we're going to be able to launch that in the not too distant future once we jump through a few hoops. I am very excited about that.
So it's still recognizing the loss, but also recognizing the future, recognizing these opportunities. It's a strange place to be in, isn't it? Yeah. So, and that is the end of our program. I'm afraid the end of our questions. So we're going to have to bring our evening program to a close, which makes me very sad. Can't thank you enough, Lach, for sharing your research with us tonight, for hanging around an extra half hour to answer all of these questions. Thank you so much. Also, a big thank you to Peter and Wendy for helping behind the scenes and making it all look so easy. And lastly, we share our thanks to all of you, our dear friends in the audience, for your love of a good story and for generously supporting the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation, whether it's with the current fall campaign or throughout the year. We couldn't do what we do without your generosity, and we greatly appreciate you. Thank you, thank you. Now, I encourage all of you to tune in for our next lecture taking place on Giving Tuesday. That's December 3rd at 7 p.m. Next week is Thanksgiving week, so we're skipping the holiday week, but we're coming back strong that first week into December. Giving Tuesday, December 3rd at 7 p.m. We're especially excited to welcome Stacy Cram as our second storyteller in the new series, Your Story is Church History. Stacy will share her own historical journey with the people, the places, and the experiences that help shape who she is today. It's going to be an evening of tales that will offer greater insight into Stacy the disciple and her path towards accepting the call to become Community of Christ's first female president prophet. Stacy's a great storyteller, and I hope you're all able to join us on December 3rd to hear her share her story. So please be sure to follow the link that Wendy just dropped into the chat to register for Stacy's program. And a reminder, it's taking place on Tuesday, not Thursday. It's Tuesday, December 3rd, Giving Tuesday at 7 p.m. Central. So until then, keep reading your church history, friends. Take care, and please have a blessed night and a wonderful Thanksgiving holiday.